When the surrender documents were signed in August and September 1945, one critical question remained unanswered. What would become of the hundreds of naval installations scattered across two oceans from the Arctic to the South Pacific? During 4 years of total war, the United States had constructed the largest network of overseas military facilities in history. Over 400 major bases had been carved from jungle, coral, and tundra at extraordinary speed and expense. Now, with hostilities ended, the enormous infrastructure that had sustained victory sat largely empty, its future uncertain. Some installations had cost tens of millions of dollars to build and could berth entire fleets. Others were crude outposts on remote atolls, hastily assembled from prefabricated materials. All faced the same predicament. They had been designed for war, and peace had arrived with startling abruptness. The scale of American military construction during the conflict had been staggering, employing over 2 million workers at its peak and consuming resources equivalent to building dozens of major cities. Yet within months of victory, these sprawling complexes would face decisions about abandonment, transfer, or transformation that would reshape the strategic landscape for decades to come. The immediate post-war situation revealed an empire of installations spread across the globe in configurations that reflected wartime necessity rather than peacetime logic. In the Pacific alone, the United States Navy operated major facilities on over 100 islands, many of which had been uninhabited before 1942. The construction had been revolutionary in both speed and scale. Naval Construction Battalions. The famous CBS had transformed remote locations into functional bases in a matter of weeks. Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands had grown from an obscure anchorage into a fleet base, accommodating over 600 ships by March 1945. Complete with floating dry docks, fuel storage for 3 million barrels of oil, ammunition dumps, recreation facilities, and a harbor that could shelter the entire Pacific Fleet. Similarly ambitious projects had sprouted across Micronesia, the Philippines, the Aleutians, and throughout the Caribbean and Atlantic. The variety of these installations defied simple categorization. At one extreme stood massive complexes like the Naval Operating Base at Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, which by 1945 employed over 30,000 personnel, and featured permanent concrete structures, extensive dock facilities, repair shops capable of servicing battleships, hospitals with over 1,000 beds, and complete infrastructure, including roads, power plants, and water treatment systems. At the other extreme were austere advanced bases on coral atolls consisting of little more than fuel bladders, ammunition stockpiles, and Quonset hut barracks. Between these extremes lay hundreds of installations of varying capability and permanence. Guam hosted facilities spread across dozens of square miles, while smaller islands like Tuk featured concentrated but sophisticated installations. The construction effort had cost an estimated $12 billion, an astronomical sum representing roughly 5% of total American war expenditure. The strategic geography of these bases told the story of the war itself in the Atlantic and Caribbean. Installations at Trinidad, Bermuda, Newfoundland, Iceland, and the Azores had secured the vital convoy routes and enabled anti-submarine operations. The Panama Canal Zone bristled with defenses and support facilities protecting the crucial waterway. In the Pacific, a vast arc of bases stretched from the Aleutians through the central Pacific island chains to Australia and New Guinea, each positioned to support the advance toward Japan. Some, like Pearl Harbor, had existed before the war, but had been expanded exponentially. Others, like the installations at Tinian and Saipan, had been built from nothing on islands captured at enormous cost. Still others, like the facilities planned for Okinawa, were only just reaching completion when hostilities ended. By autumn 1945, the United States confronted a fundamental paradox. These installations represented an unprecedented military capability and global reach. Yet maintaining them would require resources and personnel that a demobilizing nation was unwilling to provide. Military personnel strength was declining, precipitously from over 12 million in uniform at war's end to fewer than 3 million by mid-1946. The public demanded rapid demobilization. Yet the emerging tensions with the Soviet Union suggested that abandoning all Overseas positions might prove strategically unwise. Moreover, many installations had been built on land acquired through wartime emergency agreements that required renegotiation in peacetime. The British, for instance, had granted the United States 99-year leases on Caribbean bases in 1940. But other arrangements were less secure. In the Pacific, dozens of bases sat on former Japanese-commanded islands, now under uncertain political status. The American approach to this dilemma evolved through three overlapping phases: immediate reduction and consolidation, strategic retention of key facilities, and disposal or transfer of everything else. The speed of the initial drawdown was remarkable. By December 1945, just 4 months after victory over Japan, the Navy had already initiated closure procedures for over 100 bases. Personnel were evacuated. Movable equipment was shipped to other locations or sold as surplus, and facilities were either mothballed or simply abandoned. The urgency stemmed partly from practical concerns, budget pressures, and public pressure for demobilization, but also from a desire to avoid the appearance of imperial ambition that maintaining hundreds of overseas bases might suggest. The initial phase focused on the most remote and least strategically valuable installations. In the Aleutians, elaborate bases at Attu and Adak, built at great expense to support operations against Japanese-held Kiska, were swiftly reduced to caretaker status. These facilities had been particularly costly to construct and maintain due to the harsh climate and difficult logistics. The base alone had cost over $30 million to build and required constant resupply. With the Japanese threat eliminated, their isolation rendered them expendable. Similarly, many of the smaller Pacific Island installations were evacuated within months. The base at Fafuti in the Ellis Islands, which had been an important staging point for operations in the Gilbert Islands, was reduced from over 3,000 personnel to fewer than 50 by January 1946. The Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks coordinated the massive logistics of closure. Salvageable materials were inventoried and either shipped to locations where they remained useful or sold through the ROI Assets Administration. The quantities involved were staggering. From closed Pacific bases, the Navy recovered and redistributed over 2 million tons of construction materials, including steel, lumber, roofing, piping, and electrical equipment. Quonset huts, those ubiquitous prefabricated structures that had housed personnel across the globe, were either dismantled and shipped or sold locally. In some cases, entire communities in the United States were built from surplus Quonset huts, sold to address post-war housing shortages. Fuel stocks were redistributed to retained bases or sold to civilian contractors. At Alethi, over 2 million barrels of fuel oil were either transferred to Guam or sold to commercial shipping companies. Equipment that couldn't be economically moved was often destroyed or abandoned in place. On some islands, bulldozers, trucks, and construction equipment were simply pushed into the sea or buried, their value insufficient to justify transportation costs. This disposal, whilst wasteful from a material perspective, reflected hard-headed economic calculation. Shipping a bulldozer from a remote Pacific atoll to the United States could cost more than purchasing a new machine. Photographs from the period show extraordinary scenes. Rows of heavy equipment being driven off piers into deep water or airfields lined with surplus vehicles awaiting scrapping. At some locations, concrete structures were deliberately demolished to prevent their use by potentially hostile powers, whilst at others, they were simply abandoned to the elements. The British approach to their own wartime facilities, though on a smaller scale, followed a similar pattern of rapid reduction. Royal Navy bases in Ceylon, East Africa, and various Pacific locations were either handed to local authorities or abandoned. The British were even more financially constrained than the Americans, and the dismantling of empire was already underway. At Trinca, Malay, and Ceylon, what had been one of the largest British naval bases in the East was transferred to the newly independent government of Ceylon in 1948. Though the British retained limited usage rights, in contrast, the Soviet Union, which had acquired some Japanese naval facilities in Korea and the Krills as a result of their brief participation in the Pacific War, immediately set about making these installations permanent fixtures of their Pacific Fleet infrastructure. If you're finding this deep dive into post-war base disposal and retention interesting, consider subscribing for more untold stories of military infrastructure. For the United States, strategic retention focused on a carefully selected network of installations deemed essential for post-war security. Pearl Harbor remained the cornerstone of Pacific operations, and its facilities were not only retained, but further developed. Guam, with its extensive harbor, airfields, and Central Pacific location, became another permanent installation, eventually housing major naval and air force bases. Subi Bay in the Philippines, Yokosuka in Japan, and Kasibo in Japan emerged as the primary forward deployed naval bases in the Western Pacific. These installations required substantial investment to convert them from wartime facilities to permanent bases capable of supporting peacetime operations and family housing. The transformation of these retained bases reflected the shift from total war to Cold War requirements. Wartime facilities had prioritized rapid construction and maximum operational capacity with minimal concern for comfort or permanence. Peacetime bases required different infrastructure: permanent housing for service members and their families, schools, hospitals, recreational facilities, and improved working conditions. At Guam, the post-war years saw extensive construction to replace temporary wartime structures with permanent buildings. The naval station grew into a small American city, complete with suburban-style housing developments, shopping centers, and all the amenities of stateside installations. Similar transformations occurred at Yokosuka, where the former Imperial Japanese Navy base was completely rebuilt to American standards, and at Subi Bay, which evolved into the largest American naval installation in Asia. The Caribbean bases acquired through the destroyers for bases deal of 1940 presented unique challenges. These installations on British territory, including Trinidad, Bermuda, Antigua, and Jamaica, operated under 99-year leases that remained valid after the war. However, their strategic importance had shifted. The U-boat threat that had made them crucial during the war had vanished, and their primary post-war role became supporting training operations and providing logistics hubs for Caribbean and South Atlantic operations. Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico emerged as the primary American naval facility in the Caribbean, hosting a major naval station and extensive training ranges. The base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, acquired through the 1903 lease agreement following the Spanish-American War, similarly transitioned from wartime operations center to peacetime training facility. In the Atlantic, the bases at Argentia and Newfoundland and Keflavik in Iceland retained strategic importance due to their location. A strike-critical sea and air routes. The onset of the Cold War and the establishment of NATO reinforced their value. Keflavik, in particular, became a crucial link in the defense of the Atlantic and the monitoring of Soviet naval movements between the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans. The facility was substantially upgraded in the late 1940s and early 1950s, evolving from a basic wartime airfield and Zeppelin base into a sophisticated installation hosting long-range patrol aircraft and supporting anti-marine operations. The disposal phase proceeded rapidly at installations not designated for retention. The WWII administration, established specifically to handle surplus military property, conducted sales and transfers of closed facilities. In many cases, portions of bases were transferred to local governments or civilian organizations. In the Pacific, several former naval air stations were converted to civilian airports. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, built at such cost in blood and materials in 1942, became the foundation for the Solomon Islands' main international airport. Similarly, facilities on numerous Pacific islands provided the basis for civilian aviation infrastructure in the post-war era. Environmental considerations, though far less developed than they would later become, did factor into disposal decisions in some cases. Fuel contamination was recognized as a problem at some locations, and efforts were made to drain storage tanks and remove surface contamination. Though by modern standards, these remediation efforts were rudimentary at best. At some installations, ammunition and explosives were simply dumped at sea, creating hazards that would later require extensive clearance operations. Chemical waste from fuel storage, paint, and maintenance operations was often buried or left in place, creating legacy contamination issues that wouldn't be fully recognized for decades. The economic impact of base closures was significant for communities that had grown up around wartime installations. In some Pacific locations, entire economies had become dependent on the American military presence. The island of Espiritu Santo in the New Heads had been transformed by the construction of multiple airfields, seaplane base, and extensive support facilities. At its peak, over 40,000 American personnel had been stationed there, and the local population had found employment and economic opportunity serving their needs. The rapid drawdown left these communities economically stranded. Similar situations occurred throughout the Pacific, Caribbean, and even in remote American locations like the Aleutians, where civilian communities had grown up to support the bases. Some installations entered a state of indefinite limbo, neither fully abandoned nor actively maintained. Dozens of Pacific Island facilities were placed in caretaker status with minimal personnel assigned to prevent deterioration and guard against unauthorized access. These skeleton crews, often just a handful of men, found themselves posted to increasingly isolated locations as surrounding infrastructure was removed. The psychological toll of these assignments was considerable. The Navy eventually reduced even these minimal presences at all but a few locations. Wake Island maintained a small permanent presence, as did Johnston Atoll. Due to its use for ammunition storage and later for chemical weapons storage and disposal, the transfer of bases to other nations took various forms. In the Philippines, the understanding that independence would follow the war-shaped planning for Subive and other facilities, the bases were retained under an agreement that granted the United States long-term leases. But sovereignty rested with the newly independent Philippine government from 1946 onwards. In Japan, the occupation transformed former Imperial Japanese Navy installations into American bases, a process that involved complex legal arrangements that would persist for decades. Yokozuka Sabo, other facilities, technically remained Japanese property under American occupation authority, creating ambiguities that required decades to fully resolve. The Korean War reversed some of the base closure momentum, demonstrating that the Pacific was not yet peaceful and that forward-deployed facilities retained crucial importance. Several installations that had been reduced to caretaker status or closed were hastily reactivated. The conflict validated the decision to retain major bases in Japan and Guam and led to the establishment of substantial installations in South Korea, including at Qinghai. The emergency also prompted reassessment of abandoned facilities. At a few locations, surveys were conducted to determine if they could be rapidly reactivated if necessary. By the mid-1950s, the pattern was clear. The United States had retained approximately 30 major naval installations worldwide, compared to over 400 that had existed in 1945. These included the crown jewels of Pearl Harbor, Guam, Suba Bay, Yokosuka, and Sekbo in the Pacific, Roosevelt Roads, Guantanamo Bay, and selected Caribbean locations in the Atlantic, and bases at Norfolk, San Diego, and other American ports that had been vastly expanded during the war. The remainder had been closed, transferred, or reduced to minimal presence. The disposed facilities represented an enormous loss of physical assets, but the concentration on strategic locations created a more sustainable and effective global presence. The surviving bases continued to evolve. At Guam, for instance, both Navy and Air Force facilities expanded dramatically during the Vietnam War, with the island serving as a crucial staging area for B-52 operations. Subbay grew into a vast naval complex supporting the 7th Fleet and providing repair, supply, and rest facilities for ships operating throughout the Pacific and Indian Oceans. These installations became permanent fixtures, small American territories abroad, complete with schools operated by the Department of Defense Education Activity, American-style housing, shopping facilities, and all the infrastructure of modern bases. The end of the Cold War triggered another round of base closures and consolidations. Subi Bay and Clark Air Base in the Philippines were closed in the early 1990s, ending nearly a century of American military presence. The bases at Kielvik and Bermuda, were eventually closed. Even at retained installations like Guantanamo Bay, activities were scaled back. This second wave of closures, like the first, involved complex questions about environmental remediation, property transfer, and economic impact. The cleanup of contamination at former bases became a major undertaking with the American government spending hundreds of millions of dollars addressing fuel contamination, heavy metals, and in some cases, unexploded ordnance and chemical contamination. Today, remnants of the wartime bases can still be found across the Pacific and Caribbean. On remote atolls, concrete foundations, rusting quonset huts, and deteriorating piers mark where tens of thousands once worked and lived. Underwater bulldozers and vehicles dumped decades ago have become artificial reefs encrusted with coral and inhabited by fish. On Espiritu Santo Million Dollar Point, where the Americans dumped vast quantities of equipment rather than not sell it to local interests, has become a tourist attraction for divers. At Ulithi, the massive floating dry docks that service battleships have long since been towed away. But coral-encrusted mooring buoys still dot the lagoon. Several of the retained bases have themselves now been closed or substantially reduced. The end of the Cold War eliminated many of the strategic imperatives that had justified their retention. Roosevelt Roads was closed in 2004, returning over 8,000 acres to Puerto Rico. The Midway Islands, site of the war's pivotal carrier battle and home to a naval air station for decades after, were transferred to the Fish and Wildlife Service in 1996 and designated a national wildlife refuge. Henderson Field on Midway continues to operate as an airstrip for wildlife management, a vastly reduced role compared to its wartime and Cold War importance. The fate of these installations influenced Cold War strategy profoundly. The American ability to project naval power globally rested on the network of bases, retained from the Second World War, Soviet naval expansion in the 1960s and 1970s represented an attempt to replicate this capability, with the USSR establishing facilities in Vietnam, Syria, Cuba, and various African nations. The competition for basing access became a crucial dimension of superpower rivalry. In this context, the American decision to retain key facilities proved strategically prescient, even as the cost of maintaining them remained substantial. The legacy of these bases extends beyond military history. Many became the foundation for civilian infrastructure in the developing world. Airports throughout the Pacific trace their origins to wartime American construction. The roads, power plants, water systems, and harbor facilities built to support military operations provided the basis for post-war economic development in numerous locations. In the Caribbean islands that had hosted American bases during the war enjoyed infrastructure advantages that shaped their post-war development trajectories. The cultural impact was equally significant, with American presence during and after the war, introducing new technologies, customs, and economic relationships that fundamentally altered local societies. Preservation of the historical memory of these bases has been uneven. Some, like the facilities at Pearl Harbor, are extensively documented and memorialized. Others have been largely forgotten, except by veterans and local communities. Archaeological surveys conducted in recent decades have documented abandoned installations before tropical vegetation completely reclaims them. The National Park Service has designated some former bases as historic sites, recognizing their significance to the American war effort. At Midway, for instance, efforts to preserve and interpret the wartime facilities complement the atoll's natural history. The strategic framework established by the Wartime Base Network continues to shape American military presence today. Modern installations at Guam, Japan, and elsewhere trace their lineage directly to the wartime construction. Debates about base closures, host nation agreements, and environmental remediation echo the issues confronted in 1945, the rapid demobilization after World War II, followed by the realizations imposed by the Korean War, taught lessons about maintaining capabilities that would influence military planning for generations. The balance between maintaining global reach and managing costs remains as challenging today as it was in the immediate post-war years. When the surrender documents were signed in 1945, they initiated not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a massive logistical and strategic challenge. What to do with hundreds of installations built for a conflict that had ended? The response, a mixture of abandonment, retention, and transformation, created the foundation for America's post-war global military presence, whilst disposing of an enormous surplus of facilities. Of the 400 major bases that existed at war's end, only a fraction survive today. Yet their influence persists in the strategic geography of American power, in the physical landscape of islands across two oceans, and in the memories of those who built, operated, and ultimately closed them. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to Japanese naval vessels after World War II next. It explores how captured Japanese warships were divided amongst the Allies, tested and ultimately destroyed in atomic bomb trials and disposal operations. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more.